Okie dokie, piddly pokey. How's it going? It's the next day. What day? I keep checking. It's the 12th. I should know this by now. 12th of January, 2021. And it is freezing. And I'm not even in like a cold country, but it's warm in the daytime. But when that sun goes down, woof! And I may need to comb my beard. It's looking a little scraggly. We're in the home stretch of Demian. Welcome. And we've got one big chapter where I think we're going to meet the mother. And then we've got a short one. That's what she said. And then we'll see if I'll do two or it's a pretty long chapter, so I'll probably I'll do the final chapter tomorrow likely. But anyway, it's been a good day. I did some good exercise. I'm no runner, but I did a nice long walk today that felt very good. And got my first... I got some exciting stuff I'll share with you. I may start to do this on this thing. I got Philip K... can't even see that. Philip K. Dick's book Valis, followed by Valis 2 and Valis 3. And this is my first ever book that I've ever read by Dick. And it will not be the last so far. I've only read the first chapter and I'm already completely enthralled. And then I also got this very exciting book called The Hidden Passion, a novel of the Gnostic Christ based on the Nag Hammadi texts. And I have an idea of where to go forward with this because I'm thinking this, I'm thinking Siddhartha, and I'm thinking the Passion of the Christ, a very sort of Gnostic, alternative Christianity reading. I mean, I started out doing all the Lord of the Rings books. Obviously, he's a traditional Catholic, but today's Catholicism is something that Tolkien wouldn't even recognize. So I don't feel like it's too much of a deviation. But I'm starting to think a lot about that. Hess is obviously a sort of Gnostic himself, with being in the existential tradition of Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. Both have been affiliated with Gnosticism, although we often think, well, no, Dostoevsky's Eastern Orthodoxy and Nietzsche's an atheist. Well, it's not quite like that. And there's some Jungian stuff going on in Demian, and he was obviously a Gnostic. So I'm digging that idea. Although I also wanted to read through the kids series, The Dark is Rising sequence. I read those myself as a kid, loved them. However, I got to the last book. I think it's called Silver on the Tree. And I remember I was at school and it was just, I wasn't digging it for some reason. I didn't know what was going on. Having just loved The Grey King, which is the book that immediately precedes it. I liked Oversea Under Stone, the first one. I loved The Dark is Rising, the second. Treebeard, I actually sat in a car waiting for my mom and read the whole thing in that car. I remember, not that she didn't leave me like a dog without the window turned down. But I just remember it was a long thing, and I used to read so quickly as a kid. So I got through that. Then loved The Grey King, and but then stopped, which just amazes me that I didn't finish a series. But I do want to get through those, and they're much more on the Gnostic, Marcionite, good versus evil type thing. It's not really Orthodox Christianity or anything like that. I'm liking this idea though. Anyway, this is a long reading tonight, so I better get started. I've already done 4.5 minutes, but it's better than me yakking on about the latest thing in America land, because that's just ridiculous. And it's so dated as well. I mean, this, a year from now, people are going to be like, what was you talking about? That is, if, they haven't come for our heads and everything. I'm not a Trump guy, by the way. I just was seeing things on the media and knowing things were not true. And so I was beginning to just look at it and be like, ugh, what's going on here? And It will be very interesting to see how that Capitol Hill incident will be portrayed in the inevitable film. I already see it as being a sort of Gerard Butler White House is down type thing, even though it was a bunch of real protesters. But from what I've seen, there were some LARPers that were let in. Anyway, I shouldn't say this. I'm not allowed to say this. Sorry. Please, algorithms, don't cancel my video. I don't know what I was saying. I'm sorry. I just, recognized a few people. But anyway, chapter 7. All right, chapter 7. Eva. Eva Braun? Eva Gabor? No, just Eva so far. Once, during my vacation, I visited the house where years before Demian had lived with his mother. I saw an old woman sitting in the garden, and speaking with her, learned that it was her home. I inquired after the Demian family. She remembered them very well, but could not tell me where they lived at present. Sensing my interest, she took me into the house, brought out a leather album, and showed me a photo of Demian's mother. I could hardly remember what she looked like, but now as I saw the small likeness, my heart stood still. It was my dream image. That was she, the tall, almost masculine woman who resembled her son, with maternal traits, severity, passion, beautiful and alluring, beautiful and unapproachable, daemon and mother, fate and beloved. There was no mistaking her. To discover in this fashion that my dream image existed struck me as a miracle. So there was a woman who looked like that, who bore the features of my destiny. And to be Demian's mother? Where was she? Shortly afterwards, I embarked on my trip. I'm just sitting here thinking, it was totally normal to have a crush on a yummy mummy. I mean, there were plenty of where I was growing up. Hope none of my friends see this from when we were kids. What a strange journey it was. I traveled restlessly from place to place, following every impulse, always searching for this woman. There were days when everyone I met reminded me of her, echoed her, seemed to resemble her, drew me through the streets of unfamiliar cities, through railroad stations and into trains as in an intricate dream. There were other days when I realized the futility of my search. Then I would idly sit somewhere in a park or in some hotel garden, in a waiting room, trying to make the picture come alive within me. But it had become shy and elusive. I found it impossible to fall asleep. Only while traveling on the train could I catch an occasional brief nap. Once in Zurich, a woman approached me, an impudent, pretty creature. I took hardly any notice of her and walked past as though she didn't exist. I would rather have died on the spot than have paid attention to another woman, even for an hour. Apologies, I shouldn't be drinking this because it's giving me the burps. I felt my fate drawing me on. That wasn't product placement, by the way. Okay, I'm sorry, no more interruptions. I felt the moment of my fulfillment coming near, and I was sick with impatience at not being able to do anything. Once in a railroad station, in Innsbruck, I think, I caught sight of a woman who reminded me of her, in a train just pulling away. I was miserable for days. And suddenly, the form reappeared in a dream one night. I awoke humiliated and by the futility of my hunt, and I took the next train home. A few weeks later, I enrolled at the University of H. I found everything disappointing. The lectures on the history of philosophy were just as uninspired and stereotyped as the activities of most of the students. Everything seemed to run according to an old pattern. Everyone was doing the same thing, and the exaggerated gaiety on the boyish faces looked depressingly empty and ready-made. But at least I was free. I had the whole day to myself, lived quietly and peacefully in an old house near the town wall, and on my table lay a few volumes of Nietzsche. I lived with him, sensed the loneliness of his soul, perceived the fate that had propelled him on inexorably. I suffered with him and rejoiced that there had been one man who had followed his destiny so relentlessly. Late one evening I was sauntering through town. An autumn wind was blowing, and I could hear the fraternities frolic in the taverns. Clouds of tobacco smoke drifted out open windows with a profusion of song, loud, rhythmic yet uninspired, lifelessly uniform. I stood at a street corner and listened. Out of 2 bars, the methodically rehearsed gaiety of youth rang out against the night. False communion everywhere, everywhere shedding the responsibility of fate, flight to the herd for warmth. 2 men slowly walked past behind me. I caught a few words of their conversation. "Isn't it just like the young man's house in a crawl?" said one of them. "Everything fits down to the tattooing, which is in vogue again. Look, that's young Europe." The voice sounded strangely and admonishingly familiar. I followed the 2 of them down the dark lane. One of them was a Japanese, small and elegant. Under a street lamp I saw his yellow face light up in a smile. The other was now speaking again. "I imagine it's just as bad where you come from in Japan. People that don't follow the herd are rare everywhere. There are some here, too." I felt a mixture of alarm and joy at each word. I knew the speaker. It was Demian. I followed him and the Japanese to the wind-swept streets, listening to their conversation. I relished the sound of Demian's voice. It still had its familiar ring. The same old beautiful certainty and calm had all their old power over me. Now all was well. I had found him. At the end of a street in the suburbs, the Japanese took his leave and unlocked his house door. Demian retraced his steps. I had stopped and was waiting for him in the middle of the street. I became very agitated as I saw him approach upright with elastic step in a brown rubber raincoat. He came closer without changing his pace until he stopped a few steps in front of me. Then he removed his hat and revealed his old light-skinned face with a decisive mouth and the peculiar brightness on his broad forehead. "Demian," I called out. He stretched out his hand. "So it's you, Sinclair. I was expecting you. Did you know I was here?" "I didn't exactly know it, but I definitely wished you were. I didn't catch sight of you until this evening. You've been following us for quite some time." "Did you recognize me at once?" "Of course. You've changed somewhat, but you have the sign." "The sign? What kind of sign?" "We used to call it the Mark of Cain earlier on, if you can still remember. It's our sign. You've always had it. That's why I became your friend. But now it has become more distinct." "I wasn't aware of that. Or actually, yes, once I painted a picture of you, Demian, and was astonished that it also resembled myself." "Was that the sign?" "That was it. It's good that you're here. My mother will be pleased, too." Suddenly I was frightened. "Your mother? Is she here, too? But she doesn't know me." "But she knows about you. She will recognize you even without my saying who you are. We've been in the dark about you for a long time. I often wanted to write you, but it was no use. I've known for some time that I would find you soon, and I waited for it each day." He thrust his arm under mine and walked along with me. An aura of calm surrounded him, which affected me too. Soon we were talking as we used to talk in the past. Our thoughts went back to our time in school, the confirmation classes, and also to that last unhappy meeting during my vacation. Only our earliest and closest bond, the Franz Kromer episode, was never mentioned. Suddenly we found ourselves in the midst of a strange conversation touching on many ominous topics. Picking up where Demian left off in his conversation with the Japanese, we had discussed the life most of the students led, then came to something else, something that seemed to lie far afield. Yet in Demian's words, an intimate connection became evident. He spoke about the spirit of Europe and the signs of the times. Everywhere, he said, we could observe the reign of the herd instinct, nowhere freedom and love. All this false communion, from the fraternities to the choral societies and the nations themselves, was an inevitable development, was a community born of fear and dread, out of embarrassment, but inwardly rotten, outworn, close to collapsing. "Genuine communion," said Demian, "is a beautiful thing, but what we see flourishing everywhere is nothing of the kind. The real spirit will come from the knowledge that separate individuals have of one another, and for a time it will transform the world. The community spirit at present is only a manifestation of the herd instinct. Men fly into each other's arms because they are afraid of each other. The owners are for themselves, the workers for themselves, the scholars for themselves. And why are they afraid? You are only afraid if you are not in harmony with yourself. People are afraid because they have never owned up to themselves. A whole society composed of men afraid of the unknown within them. They all sense that the rules they live by are no longer valid, that they live according to archaic laws. Neither their religion nor their morality is in any way suited to the needs of the present. For 100 years or more, Europe has done nothing but study and build factories. They know exactly how many ounces of powder it takes to kill a man, but they don't know how to pray to God. They don't even know how to be happy for a single contented hour. Just look at a student dive, or a resort where the rich congregate. It's hopeless. Dear Sinclair, nothing good can come of all this. These people who huddle together in fear are filled with dread and malice. No one trusts the other. They hanker after ideals that are ideals no longer, but they will hound the man to death who sets up a new one. I can feel the approaching conflict. It's coming, believe me, and soon. Of course, it will not improve the world. Whether the workers kill the manufacturers or whether Germany makes war on Russia will merely mean a change of ownership. But it won't have been entirely in vain. It will reveal the bankruptcy of present-day ideals. There will be a sweeping away of Stone Age gods. God is dead and we have killed him. Nietzsche. The world as it is now wants to die, wants to perish, and it will. And what will happen to us during this conflict? To us? Well, perhaps we'll perish in it. Our kind can be shot too. Only we aren't done away with as easily as all that. Around what remains of us, around those of us who survive, the will of the future will gather. The will of humanity, which our Europe has shouted down for a time with its frenzy of technology, will come to the fore again. And then it will become clear that the will of humanity is nowhere and never was identical with the will of present-day societies, states and peoples, clubs and churches. No, what nature wants of man stands indelibly written in the individual, in you, in me. It stood written in Jesus, it stood written in Nietzsche. These tendencies, which are the only important ones and which of course can assume different forms every day, will have room to breathe once the present societies have collapsed. It was late when we stopped in front of a garden by the river. "This is where we live," said Demian. "You must come visit us soon. We've been waiting for you." Elated, I walked the long way home through a night which had now turned chill. Here and there students were reeling noisily to their quarters. I had often marked the contrast between their almost ludicrous gaiety and my lonely existence, sometimes with scorn, sometimes with a feeling of deprivation. But never until today had I felt with as much calm and secret strength how little it mattered to me, how remote and dead this world was for me. I remembered civil servants in my hometown, worthy old gentlemen who clung to the memories of their drunken university days as to keepsakes from paradise and fashioned a cult of their vanished student years as poets or other romantics fashioned their childhood. It was the same everywhere. Everywhere they looked for freedom and luck in the past, out of sheer dread of their present responsibilities and future course. They drank and caroused for a few years, and then they slunk away to become serious-minded gentlemen in the service of the state. Yes, our society was rotten, and these student stupidities were not so stupid, not so bad as 100 other things. By the time I reached my distant house and was preparing for bed, all these thoughts had vanished, and my entire being clung expectantly to the great promise that this day had brought me. As soon as I wished, even tomorrow, I was to see Demian's mother. Let the students have their drunken orgies and tattoo their faces. The rotten world could await its destruction for all I cared. I was waiting for one thing, to see my fate step forth in a new guise. I slept deeply until late in the morning. The new day dawned for me like a solemn feast, the kind I had not experienced since childhood. I was full of a great restlessness, yet without fear of any kind. I felt that an important day had begun for me, and I saw and experienced the changing world around me, expectant, meaningful, and solemn. Even the gentle autumn rain had its beauty and a calm and festive air full of happy, sacred music. For the first time, the outer world was perfectly attuned to the world within. It was a joy to be alive. No house, no shop window, no face disturbed me. Everything was as it should be, without any of the flat, humdrum look of the everyday. Everything was a part of nature, expectant and ready to face its destiny with reverence. That was how the world had appeared to me in the mornings when I was a small boy, on the great feast days at Christmas or Easter. I had forgotten that the world could still be so lovely. I had grown accustomed to living within myself. I was resigned to the knowledge that I had lost all appreciation of the outside world, that the loss of its bright colors was an inseparable part of the loss of my childhood, and that, in a certain sense, one had to pay for freedom and maturity of the soul with the renunciation of this cherished aura. But now, overjoyed, I saw that all this had only been buried or clouded over, and that it was still possible, even if you had become liberated and had renounced your childhood happiness, to see the world shine and to savor the delicious thrill of the child's vision. The moment came when I found my way back to the garden at the edge of town, where I had taken leave of Demian the night before. Hidden behind tall, wet trees stood a little house, bright and livable. Tall plants flowered behind plate glass. Behind glistening windows, dark walls shone with pictures and rows of books. The front door led straight into a small, warm hallway. A silent old maid, dressed in black with a white apron, showed me in and took my coat. She left me alone in the hallway. I looked around and at once was swept into the middle of my dream. High up on the dark, wood-paneled wall above a door hung a familiar painting. My bird with the golden yellow sparrow hawk's head, clambering out of the terrestrial shell. Deeply moved, I stood there motionless. I felt joy and pain as though this moment everything I had ever done and experienced returned to me in the form of a reply and fulfillment. In a flash, I saw hosts of images throng past my mind's eye. My parents' house, with the old coat of arms above the doorway, the boy Demian sketching the emblem, myself as a boy under the fearful spell of my enemy Cromer, myself as an adolescent in my room at school painting my dream bird at a quiet table, the soul caught in the intricacies of its own threads, and everything to this present moment resounded once more within me, was affirmed by me, answered, sanctioned. With tears in my eyes, I stared at my picture and read within myself. Then I lowered my eyes. Beneath the painting of the bird in the open door stood a tall woman in a dark dress. It was she. I was unable to utter a word. With a face that resembled her son's, timeless, ageless, and full of inner strength, the beautiful woman smiled with dignity. Her gaze was fulfillment, her greeting a homecoming. Silently, I stretched my hands out to her. She took both of them in her firm, warm hands. "You are Sinclair. I recognized you at once. Welcome." Her voice was deep and warm. I drank it up like sweet wine. And now I looked up and into her quiet face, the black, unfathomable eyes, at her fresh, ripe lips, the clear, regal brow that bore the sign. "How glad I am," I said, and kissed her hands. "I believe I have been on my way my whole life, and now I have come home." She smiled like a mother. "One never reaches home," she said, "but where paths that have affinity for each other intersect, the whole world looks like home for a time." She was expressing what I had felt on my way to her. Her voice and her words resembled her son's, and yet were quite different. Everything was riper, warmer, more self-evident. But just as Max had never given anyone the impression of being a boy, so his mother did not appear at all like a woman who had a full-grown son. So young and sweet were her face and hair, so taut and smooth her golden skin, so fresh her mouth. More regal even than in my dreams, she stood before me. This, then, was the new guise in which my fate revealed itself to me, no longer stern, no longer setting me apart, but fresh and joyful. I made no resolutions, took no vows. I had attained a goal, a high point on the road. From there, the next stage of the journey appeared unhampered and marvelous, leading toward promised lands. Whatever might happen to me now, I was filled with ecstasy, that this woman existed in the world, that I could drink in her voice and breathe her presence. No matter whether she would become my mother, my beloved, or a goddess, if she could just be here, if only my path would be close to hers. She pointed up to my painting. "You never made Max happier than with this picture," she said thoughtfully. "And me too. We were waiting for you, and when the painting came, we knew that you were on your way. When you were a little boy, Sinclair, my son one day came home from school and said to me, 'There is a boy in school. He has the sign on his brow. He asked to become my friend.' That was you. You have not had an easy time, but we had confidence in you. You met Max again during one of your vacations. You must have been about 16 at the time. Max told me about it." I interrupted. "He told you about that? That was the most miserable period of my life." "Yes," Max said to me. "Sinclair has the most difficult part coming now. He's making one more attempt to take refuge among the others. He's even begun going to bars, but he won't succeed. His sign is obscured, but it sears him secretly." Wasn't it like that? Yes, exactly. Then I found Beatrice, and I finally found a master again. His name was Pistorius. Only then did it become obvious to me why my boyhood had been so closely bound up with Max, and why I could not free myself from him. Dear mother, at that time I often thought that I should have to take my life. Is the way as difficult as this for everybody? She stroked my hair. The touch felt as light as a breeze. "It is always difficult to be born. You know the chick does not find it easy to break his way out of the shell. Think back and ask yourself, was the way all that difficult? Was it only difficult? Wasn't it beautiful, too? Can you think of a more beautiful and easier way?" I shook my head. "It was difficult," I said, as though I were asleep. "It was hard until the dream came." She nodded and pierced me with a glance. "Yes, you must find your dream. Then the way becomes easy. But there is no dream that lasts forever. Each dream is followed by another, and one should not cling to any particular one." I was startled and frightened. Was that a warning? A defensive gesture so soon? But it didn't matter. I was prepared to let her guide me and not to inquire into goals. "I do not know," I said, "how long my dream is supposed to last. I wish it could be forever. My fate has received me under the picture of the bird like a lover and like a beloved. I belong to my fate and to no one else." "As long as the dream is your fate, you should remain faithful to it," she confirmed in a serious tone of voice. I was overcome by sadness and a longing to die in this enchanted hour. I felt tears. What an infinity since I had last wept, well up irresistibly in my eyes and overwhelmed me. I turned abruptly away from her, stepped to the window and stared blindly into the distance. I heard her voice behind me, calm and yet brimful with tenderness as a beaker with wine. "Sinclair, you are a child. Your fate loves you. One day it will be entirely yours, just as you dream it, if you remain constant to it." I had gained control of myself and turned toward her again. She gave me her hand. "I have a few friends," she said with a smile. "A few very close friends who call me Frau Eva. You shall be one of them if you wish." She led me to the door, opened it, and pointed into the garden. "You'll find Max out there." I stood dazed and shaken under the tall trees, not knowing whether I was more awake or more in a dream than ever. The rain dripped gently from the branches. Slowly I walked out into the garden that extended some way along the river. Finally I found Demian. He was standing in an open summer house, stripped to the waist, punching a suspended sandbag. I stopped, astonished. Demian looked strikingly handsome with his broad chest and firm, manly features. The raised arms with taut muscles were strong and capable. The movements sprang playfully and smoothly from hips, shoulders, and wrists. "Demian," I called out, "what are you doing there?" He laughed happily. "Practicing. I've promised the Japanese a boxing match. The little fellow is as agile as a cat, and of course just as sly, but he won't be able to beat me. There's a very slight humiliation for which I have to pay him back." He put on his shirt and coat. "You've seen my mother?" he asked. "Yes, Demian. What a wonderful mother you have. Frau Eva. The name fits her perfectly. She is like a universal mother." For a moment, he looked thoughtfully into my face. "So you know her name already. You can be proud of yourself. You are the first person she has told it to during the first meeting." From this day on, I went in and out of the house like a son or brother, but also as someone in love. As soon as I opened the gate, as soon as I caught sight of the tall trees in the garden, I felt happy and rich. Outside was reality. Streets and houses, people and institutions, libraries and lecture halls. But here inside was love. Here lived the legend and the dream. And yet we lived in no way cut off from the outside world. In our thoughts and conversations, we often lived in the midst of it, only on an entirely different plane. We were not separated from the majority of men by a boundary, but simply by another mode of vision. Our task was to represent an island in the world, a prototype perhaps, or at least a prospect of a different way of life. I, who had been isolated for so long, learned about the companionship which is possible between people who have tasted complete loneliness. I never again hankered after the tables of the fortunate and the feasts of the blessed. Never again did envy or nostalgia overcome me when I witnessed the collective pleasures of others. And gradually, I was initiated into the secret of those who wear the sign in their faces. We who wore the sign might justly be considered odd by the world, yes, even crazy and dangerous. We were aware, were in the process of becoming aware, and our striving was directed toward achieving a more and more complete state of awareness, while the striving of the others was a quest aimed at binding their opinions, ideals, duties, their lives and fortunes more and more closely to those of the herd. There too was striving. There too were power and greatness. But whereas we who were marked believed that we represented the will of nature to something new, to the individualism of the future, the others sought to perpetuate the status quo. Humanity, which they loved as we did, was for them something complete that must be maintained and protected. For us, humanity was a distant goal toward which all men were moving, whose image no one knew, whose laws were nowhere written down. Apart from Frau Eva, Max and myself, various other seekers were more or less closely attached to the circle. Quite a few had set out on very individual paths, had set themselves quite unusual goals and clung to specific ideas and duties. They included astrologers and Kabbalists, also a disciple of Count Tolstoy, and all kinds of delicate, shy, and vulnerable creatures, followers of new sects, devotees of Indian asceticism, vegetarians, and so forth. We actually had no mental bonds in common save the respect which each one accorded the ideals of the other. Those with whom we felt a close kinship were concerned with mankind's past search for gods and ideals. Their studies often reminded me of Pistorius. They brought books with them, translated aloud texts in ancient languages, showed us illustrations of ancient symbols and rites, and taught us to see how humanity's entire store of ideals so far consisted of dreams that had emanated from the unconscious, of dreams in which humanity groped after its intimations of future potentialities. Thus we became acquainted with the wonderful thousand-headed tangle of gods from prehistory to the dawn of the Christian conversion. We heard the creeds of solitary holy men, of the transformations religions undergo in their migrations from one people to another. Thus, from everything we collected in this manner, we gained a critical understanding of our time and of contemporary Europe. With prodigious efforts, mighty new weapons had been created for mankind, but the end was flagrant, deep desolation of the spirit. Europe had conquered the whole world only to lose her own soul. Our circle also included believers, adherents of certain hopes and healing faiths. There were Buddhists who sought to convert Europe, a disciple of Tolstoy who preached non-resistance to evil, as well as other sects. We in the inner circle listened but accepted none of these teachings as anything but metaphors. We who bore the mark felt no anxiety about the shape the future was to take. All of these faiths and teachings seemed to us already dead and useless. The only duty and destiny we acknowledged was that each one of us should become so completely himself, so utterly faithful to the active seed which nature planted within him, that in living out its growth, he could be surprised by nothing unknown to come. Wow. Although we might not have been able to express it, we all felt distinctly that a new birth amid the collapse of this present world was imminent, already discernible. Demian often said to me, "What will come is beyond imagining. The soul of Europe is a beast that has lain fettered for an infinitely long time, and when it's free, its fast movements won't be the gentlest. But the means are unimportant if only the real needs of the soul, which has for so long been repeatedly stunted and anesthetized, come to light. Then our day will come. Then we will be needed, not as leaders and lawgivers. We won't be there to see the new laws, but rather as those who are willing, as men who are ready to go forth and stand prepared wherever fate may need them. Look, all men are prepared to accomplish the incredible if their ideals are threatened, but no one is ready when a new ideal, a new and perhaps dangerous and ominous impulse makes itself felt. The few who will be ready at that time and who will go forth will be us. That is why we are marked, as Cain was, to arouse fear and hatred and drive men out of a confining ideal into more treacherous, dangerous reaches. All men who have had an effect on the course of human history, all of them without exception, were capable and effective only because they were ready to accept the inevitable. It is true of Moses and Buddha, of Napoleon and Bismarck. What particular movement one serves and what pole one is directed from are matters outside one's own choice. If Bismarck had understood the Social Democrats and compromised with them, he would have merely been shrewd but no man of destiny. The same applies to Napoleon, Caesar, Loyola, all men of that species, in fact. Always you must think of these things in evolutionary, in historical terms. When the upheavals of the earth's surface flung the creatures of the sea onto the land, and the land creatures into the sea, the specimens of the various orders that were ready to follow their destiny were the ones that accomplished the new and unprecedented. By making new biological adjustments, they were able to save their species from destruction. We do not know whether these were the same specimens that had previously distinguished themselves among their fellows as conservative upholders of the status quo, or rather as eccentrics, revolutionaries. But we do know they were ready, and could therefore lead their species into a new phase of evolution. That is why we want to be ready. Frau Eva was often present during these conversations, yet she did not participate in quite the same manner. She was a listener, full of trust and understanding, an echo for each one of us who explained his thoughts. It seemed as though all thinking emanated from her and in the end went back to her. My happiness consisted in sitting near her, hearing her voice occasionally, and sharing the rich, soulful atmosphere surrounding her. She was immediately aware of any change, any unhappiness or new development within me. It even seemed to me that my thoughts and my dreams at night were inspired by her. I would often recount them to her, and she found them comprehensible and natural. There was no unusual turn in them that she could not follow. For a time, my dreams repeated patterns of our daytime conversations. I dreamed that the whole world was in turmoil, and that by myself or with Demian, I was tensely waiting for the great moment. The face of fate remained obscured, but somehow bore the features of Frau Eva. To be chosen or spurned by her, that was fate. Sometimes she would say with a smile, "Your dream is incomplete, Sinclair. You left out the best part." And then I would remember the part I had left out and not understand how I could have forgotten it. At times I was dissatisfied with myself and tortured with desire. I believed I could no longer bear to have her near me without taking her in my arms. She sensed this too at once. Once, when I had stayed away for several days and returned bewildered, she took me aside and said, "You must not give way to desires which you don't believe in. I know what you desire. You should, however, either be capable of renouncing these desires or feel wholly justified in having them. Once you are able to make your request in such a way that you will be quite certain of its fulfillment, then the fulfillment will come. But at present, you alternate between desire and renunciation and are afraid all the time. All that must be overcome. Let me tell you a story." And she told me about a youth who had fallen in love with a planet. He stood by the sea, stretched out his arms and prayed to the planet, dreamed of it, and directed all his thoughts to it. But he knew, or felt he knew, that a star cannot be embraced by a human being. He considered it his fate to love a heavenly body without any hope of fulfillment, and out of this insight he constructed an entire philosophy of renunciation and silent, faithful suffering that would improve and purify him. Yet all his dreams reached the planet. Once he stood again on the high cliff at night by the sea and gazed at the planet and burned with love for it. And at the height of his longing he leaped into the emptiness toward the planet. But at the instant of leaping, "It's impossible" flashed once more through his mind. There he lay on the shore, shattered. He had not understood how to love. If, at the instant of leaping, he had had the strength of faith in the fulfillment of his love, he would have soared into the heights and been united with the star. "Love must not entreat," she added, "or demand. Love must have the strength to become certain within itself. Then it ceases merely to be attracted and begins to attract. Sinclair, your love is attracted to me. Once it begins to attract me, I will come. I will not make a gift of myself. I must be won." Another time she told me a different story concerning a lover whose love was unrequited. He withdrew completely within himself, believing his love would consume him. The world became lost to him. He no longer noticed blue sky and green woods. He no longer heard the brook murmur. His ears had turned deaf to the notes of the harp. Nothing mattered any more. He had become poor and wretched. Yet his love increased, and he would rather have died or been ruined than renounce possessing this beautiful woman. Then he felt that his passion had consumed everything else within him and become so strong, so magnetic that the beautiful woman must follow. She came to him, and he stood with outstretched arms ready to draw her to him. As she stood before him, she was completely transformed, and with awe he felt and saw that he had won back all he had previously lost. She stood before him and surrendered herself to him, and sky, forest, and brook all came toward him in new and resplendent colors, belonged to him, and spoke to him in his own language. And instead of merely winning a woman, he embraced the entire world, and every star in heaven glowed within him and sparkled with joy in his soul. He had loved and found himself, but most people love to lose themselves. My love for Frau Eva seemed to fill my whole life, but every day it manifested itself differently. Sometimes I felt certain that it was not she as a person whom I was attracted to and yearned for with my being, but that she existed only as a metaphor of my inner self, a metaphor whose sole purpose was to lead me more deeply into myself. Things she said often sounded like replies from my subconscious to questions that tormented me. There were other moments when I sat beside her and burned with sensual desire, and kissed objects she had touched. And little by little, sensual and spiritual love, reality and symbol began to overlap. Then it would happen that as I thought about her in my room at home in tranquil intimacy, I felt her hand in mine and her lips touching my lips. Or I would be at her house, would look into her face and hear her voice, yet not know whether she was real or a dream. I began to sense how one can possess a love constantly and eternally. I would have an insight while reading a book, and this would feel the same as Ava's kiss. She caressed my hair and smiled at me affectionately, and this felt like taking a step forward within myself. Everything significant and full of fate for me adopted her form. She could transform herself into any of my thoughts, and each of my thoughts could be transformed into her. I had been apprehensive about the Christmas vacation to be spent at my parents' house, because I thought it would be agony to be away from Frau Eva for 2 whole weeks. But it did not turn out like that. It was wonderful to be at home and yet be able to think of her. When I arrived back in H, I waited 2 more days before going to see her, so as to savor the security, this being independent of her physical presence. I had dreams, too, in which my union with her was consummated in new symbolic acts. She was an ocean into which I streamed. She was a star and I on another on my way to her, circling round each other. I told her this dream when I first visited her again. "The dream is beautiful," she said quietly. "Make it come true." There came a day in early spring that I have never forgotten. I entered the hallway. A window was open, and a stream of air let in the fresh fragrance of the hyacinths, and no one was about, so I went upstairs to Max Demian's study. I tapped lightly on the door, and, as was my custom, went in without awaiting for a reply. The room was dark, all the curtains were drawn. The door to the small adjoining room stood open. There Max had set up a chemical laboratory. That's where the only light came from. I thought no one was in and drew back one of the curtains. Then I saw Max slumped on a stool by the curtained window, looking oddly changed, and it flashed through me. "You've seen this before." His arms hung limp, hands in his lap, his head bent slightly forward, and his eyes, though open, were unseeing and dead. In one of his pupils, as in a piece of glass, a thin, harsh ray of light snapped the iris open and shut, opened and shut. The wan face was absorbed in itself and without expression, except for its immense rigidity. He resembled an age-old animal mask at the portal of a temple. He did not seem to breathe. Overcome by dread, I quietly left the room and walked downstairs. In the hallway I met Frau Eva, pale and seemingly tired, which I had never known her to be before. Just then a shadow passed over the window. The white glare of the sun suddenly fled. "I was in Max's room," I whispered rapidly. "Has something happened? He's either asleep or lost within himself. I don't know which. I saw him look like that once before." "You didn't wake him, did you?" she quickly asked. "No, he didn't hear me. I left the room immediately. Tell me, what is the matter with him?" She swept the back of her hand once across her brow. "Don't worry, Sinclair. Nothing will happen to him. He has withdrawn. It will soon pass." She stood up and went out into the garden, although it was beginning to rain. I felt that she did not want me to accompany her, and so I walked up and down the hallway, inhaled the bewildering scent of the hyacinths, stared at my bird picture above the doorway, and breathed the stifling atmosphere that filled the house that morning. What was it? What had happened? Frau Eva returned before long. Raindrops clung to her black hair. She sat down in her armchair. She seemed weary. I stepped up to her, bent over her head, and kissed the rain out of her hair. Her eyes were bright and calm, but the raindrops tasted like tears. "Shall I go and see how he is?" I asked in a whisper. She smiled weakly. "Don't be a little boy, Sinclair," she admonished me. loudly as though trying to break a spell within herself. "Get along now and come back later. I can't talk to you now." I half walked, half ran from the house and the town toward the mountains. The fine rain slanted into my face. Low clouds swept by as though weighed down with fear. Near the ground there was hardly a breath of air, but in the higher altitudes a storm seemed to rage. Several times the lurid sun broke briefly through harsh rifts in the steel-grey clouds. Then a loose yellow cloud swept across the sky, collided with the other grey bank of cloud. In a few seconds the wind had fashioned a shape out of this yellow and blue-grey mass, a gigantic bird that tore itself free of the steel-blue chaos and flew off into the sky with a great beating of wings. Then the storm became audible, and rain rattled down mixed with hail. A brief, incredible, terrifying roar of thunder cracked across the rain-lashed landscape, and immediately afterwards a gleam of sunshine burst through. On the nearby mountains the pale snow shone livid and unreal above the brown forest. When hours later I returned wet and wind-blown, Demian himself opened the door. He took me up to his room. A gas jet was burning in his laboratory, and papers were strewn about the floor. He had evidently been working. "Sit down," he invited. "You must be exhausted. It was horrible weather. One can see that you really were outside. There'll be tea in a moment." "Something is the matter today," I began hesitantly. "It can't only be a thunderstorm." He looked at me inquiringly. "Do you see something?" "Something, yes. I saw a picture in the clouds, quite clearly for a moment." "What kind of picture?" "It was a bird." "The sparrowhawk, your dream bird?" "Yes, it was my sparrowhawk. It was yellow and gigantic, and it flew off into the blue-black clouds." Demian heaved a great sigh. There was a knock on the door. The old servant brought in the tea. "Help yourself, Sinclair, please. I don't believe you saw the bird just by chance." "By chance? Does one get to see such things by chance?" "Quite right. No, one doesn't. The bird has a significance." "Do you know what?" "No. I only feel that it signifies some shattering event, a move on the part of destiny. I believe that it concerns all of us." He was pacing excitedly back and forth. "A move on the part of destiny," he shouted. "I dreamed the same kind of thing last night, and my mother had a presentiment yesterday which conveyed the same message. I dreamed I was climbing up a ladder placed against a tree trunk or tower. When I reached the top, I saw the whole landscape ablaze, a vast plain with innumerable towns and villages. I can't tell you the whole dream yet. Everything is still somewhat confused." "Do you feel that the dream concerns you personally?" "Of course. No one dreams anything that doesn't concern him personally. But it doesn't concern me only, you're right. I differentiate quite sharply between dreams that reveal movements within my own soul, and the other, far rarer dreams in which the fate of all mankind suggests itself. I have rarely had such dreams, and never before one of which I could say that it was a prophecy which was fulfilled. The interpretations are too uncertain. But I know for sure that I have dreamed something that doesn't concern me alone. For this dream links up with others, previous dreams I have had, to which it is a sequel. These are the dreams, Sinclair, which fill me with the forebodings I've spoken of to you. We both know that the world is quite rotten, but that wouldn't be any reason to predict its imminent collapse or something of the kind. But for several years I have had dreams from which I conclude, or which make me feel, that the collapse of an old world is indeed imminent. At first these were weak and remote intimations, but they have become increasingly stronger and more distinct. I still know nothing except that something is going to happen on a vast scale, something dreadful in which I myself will be involved. Sinclair, we will take part in this event that we have discussed so often. The world wants to renew itself. There's a smell of death in the air. Nothing can be born without first dying, but it is far more terrible than I had thought." I stared at him aghast. "Can you tell me the rest of your dream?" I asked shyly. He shook his head. No. The door opened to let in Frau Eva. "You're not feeling sad, I hope." She looked refreshed. All trace of fatigue had vanished. Demian smiled at her, and she came up to us as a mother approaches frightened children. "No, we are not sad, Mother. We've merely tried to puzzle out these new omens. But it's no use anyway. Whatever happens will suddenly be here. Then we shall learn soon enough what we need to know." But I felt dispirited, and when I took my leave and walked alone through the hallway, the stale scent of the hyacinths seemed cadaverous. A shadow had fallen over us. World War. That was... I'm going to admit to you, I thought that was going to turn into something sexual, and I was feeling the eroticism. Sorry, not in any rude way, but I mean I was emotionally sort of, oh, what's going to happen now? But of course, my carnal mind failed to grasp the higher meaning, but this is a sort of book I think I'll return to more than once. It's odd, you know. Normally I wouldn't enjoy something like this. It's very preachy, or not preachy, but it's not plot driven at all. It's. I mean, he said of Pistorius that Pistorius was too didactic, and this is almost didactic, but it's not. It has something of a dream quality of itself. I think that's the intention. I'm blown away. I mean, I'll admit, I'm trying to write my first novel, and I haven't even written the first paragraph. I've written several first paragraphs. I even had a new idea today, but the ideas are so small and weak compared to something like this. But again, there's no, it's so unhealthy to think that way. Better to take on the idea of grasping your destiny by the horns and being prepared and moving forward into whatever's happening. You know, we've got all this COVID stuff going on. Maybe the world is going to change. The talk of the Great Reset and so on. Well, this is the opportunity to prepare for that and face it so that nothing can shake us in our resolve to be ready and stand and face whatever comes. But yes, this is a long one, so I shall leave you now. And next time it will be the final chapter of Demian. We'll see the end and what happens. Take care, my friends, and stay salty.